Welcome, everybody. Thank you for turning out on this dark evening where you all came from pickleball or basketball or something else. And to learn about why our last several months that we've been working on Every Vote Must Count counts. Francis is going to talk to us about that in great detail. This is a book that he has co-edited with Nick Lovrich and two other gentlemen. And he'll talk about that more in his slide presentation here, which is why I didn't do a more in-depth Okay, so welcome, Francis. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate being here. And as it shows, you know, the talk is Political Civility, Our Path Forward, where really what I want to do is give you a perspective of how we got where we're at, and then what are things we can do to actually change the conversation and make a difference as we look at the civility and the civility conversation. Now, a little bit just to help you get perspective of where I'm from. I have worked for 35 years for Washington State University. I am in the psychology department, but I am an electrical engineer in the psychology department. And so the first piece people go is, how do you have an electrical engineer in the psychology department? It's normally where people look at it, and how does that get to political civility? So that's really what I want to give you, that framework. So I'm someone where someone would come to me and say, I have this new technique to help people overcome fears of snakes and spiders. And we're going to use tarantulas, and I'm going and they want my help in how do you design that experiment, and then I'll get into how are we going to measure fear. Is this a self-report? Is it a bodily function? Is there, you know, what are we measuring? Do the sensors exist in order to make that measurement? If not, I would design and build those sensors. Does the software exist in order to record the measurement from the sensors? If not, I would then write the software in order to record the measurement. And that's what I've done for 35 years, is people come to me with these new, you know, psychological tests that they're doing, and I develop things. So in that context, if you think about an engineer trying to communicate with the psychology person, we really speak different languages. So in the midst of it, I went back and also got a psychology degree in order to communicate with the psychology. And so one of the things that I see myself as is this: I've learned to interpret and help and communicate between disciplines in the process, whether it's engineering to psychology, or now into politics or into other things like that. So if we go, next slide. So in that context, Carl, next slide. Okay. So in that context, first of all, I'm that. Now, if we fast forward about 20 years ago, a little more than 20 years ago, my wife got diagnosed with breast cancer, and we went through all the cancer treatment stuff, and she is cancer-free today, which is fabulous. But in the midst of that, we had what you would consider this midlife crisis, where, you know, our perspective had been, we're going to work, and then when we retire, then we're going to go do things. And instead, we took a step back and said, you know, we may not always have our health, so what is it that we want to accomplish? And how do we want to have impact in our lives? For Heidi, she really wants to make a difference in people's lives, and so she went back, got her counseling degree, and she now has her counseling practice here in town, and that's what she does. And in particular, single moms are something that she's very passionate and focused on when it comes to counseling. For me, I was overwhelmed by the community support that we got as Heidi was going through what she was, and then we had some other health issues with some of our kids, and I looked and said, I really want to give back to my community because of what they've done for us. And so that is what led me on the path to start getting engaged in the community, volunteering for things, and then got to the point where I said, you know, I think I can make a difference if I was on city council. And I went to Heidi and I said, you know, I think I should run for city council. And she looks at me and she goes, you're an engineer. I married you because engineers are safe. Engineers don't run for politics. And I'm like, okay. And so I put it aside for a couple of years, you know, in that situation. Now, the context is, I did not grow up in a political family. I mean, we went backpacking and outdoors. Now, Heidi's Heidi's family was very political, and she's coming from that perspective. Her grandfather actually ran for governor in the 1960s for the state of Washington, in the state of Idaho, and he was the Democratic candidate and would have been elected, but he was killed in a plane crash just weeks before the election. So she was very immersed in politics growing up with her grandfather and her father and things like this. But the bug kept coming back to me, and so I went back and I said, I really think this is what I should do, and so that's how I got in politics. So within this context, not only am I an interpreter, but now I'm in this political realm where, okay, this is something that is important, and I want to see what I can do to make a difference in it. So then if you fast forward about 15 years ago, I'm sitting in Olympia, and I'm just shaking my head over what the lobbyist is telling us that the legislature is doing, and I'm going, don't they understand the impact that they're having on local government and the local communities? Don't they understand what their actions are? And I said, there's got to be a better process and a better way. And that's when I connected with Nicholas Leverich, who at that time, he was the lobbyist for Washington State University Faculty Senate. And the two of us then said, okay, let's start looking at how do we improve the processes of the legislative process in order to get better outcomes. And that's where I then started the Political Interaction Lab. And Nicholas and I have worked together on this for a number of years. So these are the kind of the context of how I got to be able to talk to you about this now. And I hope that helps in the context. So next slide. So I can't go any further without doing a special thanks to Nicholas, because Nicholas is someone who I consider an incredible mentor, colleague. We have worked through this in a lot of things, and in fact, oftentimes the two of us team present on this. And in fact, 2 weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, we were back in Delaware, at the University of Delaware, presenting on our findings as it related to the University of Delaware and the Delaware legislature as it relates to legislative civility. So next slide. So today what I want to do is kind of break the talk into 3 parts. The first is this historical of how did we get to where we're at? And then the next one is looking at what are the lessons that Nicholas and I have learned as we've done our research. And then from there, then say, okay, what's that path forward and how does it apply to us? And oftentimes when I talk about the path forward, I'm presenting to legislators or I'm presenting to local government officials. As I'm talking about this, if I talk about a leader, also put in the context of you as a leader. Whether it's at your work, whether it's with your nonprofit, wherever. I mean, these points are going to be salient and are going to apply. So next slide. If we look at where our population is right now, most people fit into one of 4 categories. And if we start with the upper left, you have, and this is the quote from former Justice Ginsburg of, why can't we go back to the good old times when people actually worked for the good of the country as opposed to using their position as a stepping stone to get somewhere else or in order to advance a specific party. Instead, they looked at what's for the good. So you have one group of people that they're just looking back. You have, and as I move around, you then have those that when it comes to politics, there are issues that are very passionate, and there's some that they've just drawn a line in the sand, and it doesn't matter how they treat the other person, what they say, what they do. All they do is care about this issue, regardless of what it does to relationships. Now, the majority of the country is in this third category, where they've avoided it, and this is the one where when I went to Thanksgiving. This would have been about 4 years ago, and I walk up to the door, and there's a sign next to the door that says, these are the topics that are not allowed to be talked about in this house. Yeah, and that was their solution is, we'll just avoid it. We just won't allow people to talk about it. And as I go through this, I hope what you learn, one of the things that you get out of it is we can't avoid it any longer. We're in this situation because we've avoided these difficult conversations that needed to be talked about. And then the fourth group is those that are out there that are working to make a difference, and they're saying, I know these conversations are difficult conversations, but it's important for us to have these conversations and to talk about them in it. Next slide. Now, if we look at how do people feel as it relates to incivility, 84% saying that they've experienced incivility in their life. And you have 75 that feel that it's risen to a crisis level when we're looking at incivility. Next slide. I'll give you a number of numbers with this. 79% feel that that incivility is at a level and is actually going to result in violence or acts of terror. Next slide. Even since President Biden took office, 41% feel that civility has actually declined in that. So the conversation hasn't been changed for the general population this way. There's still this decline that's going on that needs to be reversed in this. Next slide. Now, if we look at how long has this been going on? Is this something, so if we go back to the founding of our nation, at that time, America was this grand experiment. When we were formed as a country, it was not formed the way most countries at that time were formed. It was something where those from Europe were really curious about. And so Al de Tocqueville came and toured saying, I want to understand what it is about America. Why is it forming the way it is? And the things that he talked about was, people talked about this strict code of politeness, and they talked about civility and the rules and the norms and the traditions that are out there within this initial establishment of our country. Next slide. Back one. But it wasn't that far later that we have a sitting vice president, Aaron Burr, who kills the former Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in a duel. And this duel was over a political argument between, and it was basically a long-standing argument between the Federalists and the Democrat-Republican Party. And it was issues related to that. Next slide. And not only have we had that, but on the floor of Congress, there have been fights that are broken out. In the one on the left, over 30 members of the House got involved in this brawl. That's on the left. On the right, we've had guns that have been pulled by senators. Now, this one on the left, this brawl in Congress, what it was over was they were debating on having Kansas come in as a state to the Union, and whether or not Kansas should be a free or a slavery state. And that's what led to this. And so you see those passions that erupted there. Next slide. And if we look at over time, you can see, if we take snapshots, you can see these polarizations that have gone on in the 1920s. Next slide, getting into the 1960s with civil rights and the war. And next slide. And then even into our last few years, where is this balance between how do we protect individual freedoms, at the same time make sure that we're protecting society as a whole, and what is that balance, and how does that work? So you can see there's always, if you look at these snapshot, you see these points in time. Next slide. And within it, you'll see this cyclical nature that has gone on. And within the cyclical nature, if you look at the red lines, you'll see, I'm not going to be able to do it on the TV, but on the, you'll see how it started, and then it went into this age of discord that actually ended with the Civil War. Then after World War II, there was this next start of this, the next time in which it was civil, and then from there, it's gone on from there. So you see these cycles that have actually happened. So when they talk about going back to the golden age, depending on where you look, it may or may not be a golden age type of thing. Next slide. And within this political stress index that you see, what's going on is we're really at the peak of this line that has gotten worse and worse and worse. And that's where we're at. And this is what we're facing. And as individuals, we need to make decisions on how can we be a part of changing this. Next slide. If you take and look at trust in our government, this is, as we look at presidency, you can see this natural decline that has been going on over time. And then if we look at the next slide, where this is actually showing the trust and confidence in government, the top line is local government, the next line down is state, and the next line is Congress. And you'll see how the trust has slidden in that way to where, in order to start the conversation again around civility, around coming together and working together, Congress has really lost the American trust to where for them to come out and say, we need to do this, they're really not going to get they're not going to get the U.S. behind them. And the state legislatures have actually fallen to where it's really now local government is where there's still that trust that's built in, and that's where the conversations need to be taken the lead, is at the local government to say, how can we change this narrative? Next slide. And this is kind of representative of the voting patterns within the House of Representatives, and you see over time how those voting patterns have really separated to where it's, you're either in one side or the other side, and you don't have much crossover and mix that's going on. What you see going on there, this is indicative of the group of people that I showed at the beginning that said they've checked out of politics, they're avoiding it. And those that, predominantly that have checked out and are avoiding are in the moderate spectrum. And so what's happened is because the moderates aren't involved in politics because they're not trying to help shape it, we end up electing our congressmen and women who are more polarized, and they're going to stay in that camp, and they don't cross over and work. And so the moderates are the ones that we need to get back into that conversation in this context. Next slide. Within that, so these slides, what these show is if someone's a Democrat, how they view a Republican. If someone's a Republican, how they view a Democrat. And it's one of those where they really don't view them positively at all. And when I've been talking with legislators, I had one legislator say that, I'm sitting in my committee meeting, and everything's televised now, and this is TVW, so this is Washington State, and they go, I turn to the person next to me in order to have this conversation, and I get this text message. And the text message says, why are you talking to the enemy? So someone was watching on television, saw the person turn to talk to somebody that wasn't in their party, and the constituent was saying, why are you talking to the enemy? So this is pushed out to where they're driving our electeds in this way if the electeds don't stand up to it. The next slide. This is a picture, I think it's 2019, when former President Bush invited Ellen DeGeneres and her partner to join him for a football game. And social media just erupted, both sides, saying, how dare they cavort with the enemy? This is that mindset right now that a lot of our community has gotten into, is that one party or the other is the enemy. When we were presenting, Nicholas and I, in Nevada, we had one of our panel discussants got up and said, I used to be the minority leader for the House there in Utah. And she goes, I was really good friends with who the majority leader was. But what would happen is I would hear the din from my constituents about, why aren't you haranguing on the other party? Why aren't you yelling at them? Why aren't you doing these things? And so I would call up my friend and say, can I have 10 minutes tomorrow on the floor? And I'm going to yell at you and harangue you and your party. And then you can have 10 minutes to yell at my party and me. And they would schedule this just so that it appeared to the constituents that, they were, battling each other. And in my mind, that's the worst possible thing that our elected officials can do, is hide relationships. Because the most important thing is for us to find commonalities and find ways in which we can relate to people that we don't normally relate with. And so in my mind, our electeds need to, and this is where I talk about that trust in government, it's going to take the local electeds to get out there and say it's important to have these conversations, and it's important to have these difficult conversations. Next slide. But you'll see that, regardless of which party you're in, it is difficult to have these conversations. These are hard conversations, and because they're hard conversations, people are avoiding them. Next slide. And within that, you see 45% of the people have stopped talking to other people because of a disagreement that happened over that. So you're seeing this happening, and it's really these moderates that are checking out in these conversations. Next slide. Now, there's some things that have been worked on in order to, how do we improve processes? One is the National League of Cities, and this is 2011, so this is a little over 10 years ago, they actually put together this list of how do you treat another legislator because of things that were going on. So they were working to take that effort. Next slide. And then if you can play that video. So this gives you an example of a way candidates tried to make a difference.
Whether you vote by mail or in person, we will fully support the results of the upcoming presidential election, regardless of the outcome.
Although we sit on different sides of the aisle, we are both committed to American civility and a peaceful transition of power.
The two leading candidates for Utah governor are coming together with a message of civility.
This new PSA is being released on the same day early voting gets underway here in Utah. We have team coverage from our new specialist on Decision 2020. Jed Bull is tracking early voting in what officials say could be a historic election.
We start with Lad Egan on that call for civility come Election Day. Lad?
Yeah, the joint message from Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox and his Democratic challenger Chris Peterson is that Utah can set an example for the rest of the country.
I'm Chris Peterson.
And I'm Spencer Cox.
Political opponents running against each other for Utah governor agreeing on this.
We can debate issues without degrading each other's character.
We can disagree without hating each other.
The series of joint public service announcements call for a return to civility.
So let's show the country that there's a better way.
In an interview with KSL, the candidate said the idea for the ads came together quickly because of the important message.
We have to start treating each other with kindness. And I realize that that's not a particularly original or unique message. And the fact that it's resonating, I think, shows us how far down the wrong path we've already gone in our country.
We should have debate. We should protest. We should disagree vehemently, but we don't have to degrade each other, and we can actually solve problems working together.
It's a little bit of a light in the middle of a dark political storm.
Hinckley Institute of Politics Director Jason Perry says the ads are refreshing and show the Utah way of doing politics.
Is the kind of thing that you can do when a race is not completely close.
But to not expect such an approach in a hotly contested race like the 4th Congressional District that's full of national money and negative ads. There are a total of 3 public service announcements as part of this ad campaign. They're being shared online, also on social media, and on local television stations, including right here on KSL. And Dave, this definitely isn't something you see every day in politics. Great to see those on different sides of the aisle coming together like this.
Well, our moms have taught us for years to play nice. This is a good reminder. Lad Egan live for us tonight. Thanks, Lad.
So to play nice. And so this gives you perspective. In fact, in the last couple of weeks, a couple other ads where people have jointly worked on things. Now, if we look a little bit closer, last year, the National League of Cities, they did a survey of the local government electeds. And the thing that they found was that in this, over 80% have experienced incivility. And it's not just for them, but it's also for their spouses, their children that have been impacted. If you think about school districts and what's gone on in the last couple of years with school districts and our teachers, we had teachers in the room, it really shows. And in fact, 20% of those that were surveyed said they don't expect to finish their term. It wasn't that they're finished their term and not run again, but they were going to quit before then just because of the incivility that's happening. And this is something that is the wrong direction for us to go as a country, because we need our best people in these positions working together to come together and find the best solutions. So next slide. So within this first part, and this is the first of three, and this one takes a little bit the longest, first of all, understand there's these cycles that have gone on. It's not that it's suddenly just dropped off, but we're in the midst of a cycle. Cycles can be broken, and personally for me, I really feel that it's the local government and the community is going to be the key to reverse this process. I don't think this is something that we can look to the legislature, we can look to Congress for. We need to start as a grassroots effort. So next slide. So now I'm switching into, with the research that Nicholas and I have done, what are things that we've learned around civility, and this is particularly at the legislative level, but I'm going to talk about legislative, but then apply it to the local, and how does it work not only for local officials, but also for community members in that way. And this just highlights some of the different projects that we've worked on over the time that we'll be pulling from. And this is the book that was referenced earlier, and if you're interested in one, Nicholas and I would be happy to get you a copy of it. So next slide. And this is the team that worked on our last one, the outside looking in. And you'll see our 14 people was from across the country, these researchers that we pulled. And we're in the middle right now of recollecting data. So we're redoing this data set because the last one was from 2018-19 in order to relook at the data and how things have changed since then. And we have an even bigger group now that we're working with. Next slide. So the first part is this whole question of what is civility? And that's the thing that normally, first of all, trips people up. And civility, you have some sides of it where people see civility as a repression piece. And what I'm going to be talking about is that's not how civility is or how it should be acted. So the first piece is civility is not agreement. You don't have to have agreement to have civility. You can be civil and have civility with anyone. Now, for some people, it might be harder than others, but you can do that. But with civility is, if I'm in a conversation with the person, it's going beyond what is the issue to why does a person believe what they believe? Is it because something happened to them when they were growing up and a formative thing that really set them on a path and why they believe what they believe? Is it because they've studied more and they understand more? I mean, so it's getting to the backstory about the person, and this is where I talk about it's recognizing the person's individual dignity and worth. So rather than you're talking to a person and you say, oh, okay, you are this gender, so I'm taking these attributes that fit to everybody in that gender, and you're this culture, so I'm taking all those attributes, and you are, this party, and then I'm just assuming that's who you are. Instead, it's looking at the person as an individual, and that, yes, they may align with some of these, but they don't pull all those attributes in, but you see them as an individual in that way. And if you get into the alignments, if you go to the first part I talked about, you're really into this, what's political discrimination. And one of the things, if you think in the context of different types of discriminations, politics is the one area that is socially acceptable to discriminate in. You can't discriminate in other areas, but politics, it's socially acceptable that, well, you're that party, so I can treat you differently, regardless of who you are. And in fact, in our research, what I found is that a number of people, when we've asked them, have you discriminated because of gender or sexual orientation or because of culture, but told people you did it because of politics, we got like a third of the students, that's what they've done. And so they've actually taken other types of discrimination and they have justified it as political discrimination. But that's a whole nother area that's the separate piece on this. But instead, what it is taking time to recognize them, and then it's approaching the conversation from a context that's called intellectual humility. And intellectual humility is, I have very strong beliefs, but I know I could be wrong. And so you rather than your mind is made up, there's no way I can change, instead it's, yes, I have very strong beliefs, there's reasons why I have very strong beliefs, but I know that I could be wrong, and so I want to know why you believe what you believe, because that's going to then affect and shape what I believe. And so this is when I talk about civility, this is this context of it. Next slide. When we asked legislators and then also lobbyists on the importance of civility as it relates to policy outcomes and the work that's and what's accomplished, you'll see in here slides that are going to represent lobbyists, legislators, and down in the bottom, this is our national study where you'll see the average, you'll see which state was the highest, which was the lowest, and then where does Washington fall. And what you see in this is that across the board, they all feel that the process of civility, the process of working across the aisle is critical in those policy outcomes, but that it has declined over the years of how important it is. So our legislators pre-20,000 to our legislators now, there's a decline in the value that they see. Next slide. And the other piece that we saw in this is that the political campaign affects how people treat other people. So if I'm in a political campaign and it's a very incivil campaign, even though I win the campaign, I don't have to work with that person in the legislature, and I'm using the legislature as an example. I go to the legislature, but I carry my impressions from that campaign over, and I expect the rest of the legislators are going to treat me that same way. And so I start out in a defensive posture, and it actually goes down from there. The thing that Nicholas and I found is it is so critical, the time period between an election and someone taking office is to change that narrative. And that's where the trainings are critical, to get trainings in, to get relationships start to build during those times. Because otherwise, they're going to take that experience and carry it forward. Next slide. The legislators definitely feel that they're becoming more partisan. If we look at over time, now Washington still is pretty close to that national average. And then they're also seeing that over the last 10 years, they're seeing a greater, less civility that is happening that way. Next slide. One of the things we asked was, as it related to Congress, and Congress they talk about gridlock and people not being able to accomplish things, is are our legislators on track the same as Congress to these gridlocks? And they don't feel that they're there, but they definitely feel them, yes, all of the legislators are going the same way as Congress right now as it relates to gridlock and the polarization preventing them from actually being able to accomplish anything. Next slide. Now what we did is, we actually developed a civility measure. This is based on our 2018-2019 data, where we said which state legislators at that time were the most civil, which were the least. The most civil that we identified were Utah, Maryland, and Massachusetts. The least civil, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Arizona. Within that, and this is where we're really excited about getting our next round of data so we can compare to see which states are just consistently at the state and which ones there may be changes going on. Now if you look at Washington, Washington is definitely much better than all the neighbors all the way around as it relates to for our legislature being civil, but there's still room to grow even in Washington for our legislators. Next slide. The comments that our lobbyists made just around this is they felt that legislators that were in safe districts were more likely to be incivil because they didn't There wasn't the concern about whether or not I'm going to get elected, and so I can just do my own thing. They also felt that there is, the newer legislators have a less appreciation for the importance of civility and actually working across the aisle. Next slide. So we within this then developed 4 areas as we looked at civility factors. The first one is between elected officials, and I will have 4 different groupings. The piece that we found is that relationship is the #1 key thing that we felt is affecting the civility process. We identified that how a person builds trust, they move from, they meet the person, they find areas they respect, they find areas of common interest, common values, they become a friend, they move into a trust, and then a confiding. And for us, it's, okay, how do we move our legislators in the direction to the right? In Washington State, we found that there's been a big change as it relates to relationships with our legislators. It used to be the legislators, when they went to Olympia, they brought their entire family with them. And so they would end up having dinners together afterward. And you know, one legislator would talk about, yeah, I'd come home from being on the floor, and my wife would greet me and say, why did you say such and such to so-and-so? Don't you know we're having him and his wife over for dinner tomorrow? You know, and so you had those relationship type pieces that kind of brought people in line to where they'd be cheering their kids on at the same basketball game, you know, those that were, you know, across the aisle but sitting next to each other. Now, and some of it, if we look at what's changed, part of what's changed is our transportation network has become more efficient. So people don't have to move to Olympia, and they can't come back, but they can go back and forth. Right now, over 1/3 of our legislators commute to Olympia on a daily basis, so they don't even live in Olympia. So they go down, they do their meetings, and they leave, and they don't, that relationship piece that used to go on, fewer and fewer of the legislators are involved with that. We also found within the relationship between legislators is this strategic incivility, and as I talk about it, you'll be able to relate to other people that you know, where what would go on is the person, if they're not getting their way, then what they would do is they'd act out. You know, they would yell, they would scream, they'd get mad in an incivil way, and what it did is it caused you, the next time you were going to do something that they might not like, you would avoid it because you didn't want to face that incivility again. And so but it's a strategic incivility that they're doing. And so we found that piece going on as it relates to relationships. The next slide is leadership and the effect that leadership was having in the process. Now, our process is set up with a majority rule, but the minority's voice should be heard. And that is something that doesn't always happen, but if it's done properly, at the end of the day, the majority's vote is going to win, but the minority's voice is able to be heard. Because the minority's voice the minority doesn't always feel that their voice is heard, it is socially acceptable for that minority to act out. So for their, to be louder, or for to be more vocal, or maybe even violent in a way. Socially, that's something that's acceptable in that context as a part of this process in order to make sure their voice is heard. And so that's something just to be aware of it, and I'll touch on this later of how it is actually impacting some other things. But that's if it's done right. And that's where some people, when they say be civil, it's tamping down the minority's voice, and that's an improper use of saying be civil, because the minority's voice needs to be heard, and they need to feel that their voice is heard, and that's a piece in that. The other thing we found is that vote separation between groups. So the closer the minority count is to the majority, the more civil the process is, because they're more likely to have somebody from one party not agree with where the party wants to do, and so they have to work to keep everybody together. So they're more civil in the process. The other thing we saw is that complexity removes some of that relational piece, so that as processes get more complex, you then move into more committee structures and more specialization of duties, and you lose some of those relationships. And the last one is just understanding there are ideological differences that one party is going to set, and that's going to have an effect in the conversation and in the relationship. Next one. And so this is looking at processes. How do processes affect it? When we looked at televising, the thing that we found is that televising has actually formalized the process. It used to be that the legislators would turn and chat to each other, but now because they're in front of the camera, they can't. I had one legislator talked about he was sitting on the floor, and he gets this text, and the text says, "Stop eating carrots." And what had happened is he'd been on the floor and gotten hungry, and so he pulled out this bag and was eating carrots, and TVW had panned across and had seen him, and so they realize they're always on in this way, and it affects how they act with the televising. The other piece we saw is this process is so critical, that the process needs to be one where the process needs to be transparent. If it's not transparent, then you lose that trust. You need to make sure all voices are heard, and then the decision needs to be done in a fair way. And then it needs to also be communicated too. But if those four pieces aren't in place, you're going to have people that are complaining about the process and not trusting the process. The next thing is this code of conduct. And what we found is that if you think about that strategic incivility where someone is acting out, if they cross a line and someone gets offended because you said something, how do you then communicate it in a way that it doesn't just ratchet up the situation? And that code of conduct is something as a way to remove that power struggle where you can separate yourself from the passion and say, this is the process that needs to be done. I mean, that's the reason why if you look at Congress, one member of Congress does not address another member on the floor. They only speak to the chair. And part of that is trying to keep that decorum in place. And then the last thing we saw is that staff and legislators have different perspectives of time. Staff, when they're looking at this project, it might be a project that's going to take 5 or 10 years to complete, and so they have this long term. Whereas for the electeds, they want to be able to talk about what they accomplished this time, and they don't want to talk about, well, it's going to take 5 years to get this. They want to talk about what we've accomplished now, and so one of the things we saw is where the best solution is if you have a long-term process, you have these short-term goals that you can show accomplishments along the way. Next slide. And then the last one is we're looking at external factors on the legislative process. And what we found is technology changes. Oftentimes technology has a cost of relationship. If you think about new technology devices, oftentimes it means you are removing from talking to an individual. You're relying more on technology. Crisis and disasters can change the tenor, and that's where you think about from COVID. Some communities came out much better because the crisis disasters they came together on and actually worked together. Other communities that tore them apart. And so if there is a crisis or disaster, make sure, look at how can we work together in order for this to actually bring us closer together and more collaborative. The legislators are moving more and more to this permanent campaign cycle where they're always up for election, and that's their focus. And then negative campaign speech, which I talked about earlier, how important it is to break that cycle. Next slide. So within this second part, this is where, what are these things that we learned from the research is one, that relationship is the key that we're finding as it relates to civility for legislators. There is definitely a decline that's going on that needs to be worked on, and that the civility does have direct effect on outcomes and our communities. So then if we go to the next slide, now I'm going to, from here, transition into what's our path forward for us, and how can we change and make a difference. And so for the next slide, with this one, and this is just highlights I'm showing you, the National League of Cities within their report, they grouped into 3 areas. One of them is that's around security. And this is something that if our electeds don't feel safe, then they're going to pull back from relationship. And if you take a look at this is where you start looking at our school board members, our teachers. If they're not feeling that the space is safe for them, then it's going to affect that relationship that's going on. And that's where, I start saying, I'll talk legislators, but start thinking about it in your context in that way. So the importance of that, the safety and the infrastructure piece. Next slide. The other things they talked about is the impact of mental health, that the incivility really is making, it is affecting people's lives and their mental health. And I hear so much about it from Heidi with, the people that she's counseling, just the impact that it's having. But that's something that we need to understand, that if our school board, if as an elected official, if as a teacher you've gone through a trauma, that trauma is there, and that's something that's important for to make sure we acknowledge and work through it, and it isn't just left untouched. And then this last one on civil discourse, I'm going to, with other slides, jump into those more. So next slide. So for us, first of all, model civility. Understand you don't have to be in agreement with them to model. I know that for some people it's going to be harder for you to model it than others. But it's critical and important that way. And personally, I hope, we're in a community here, and I know I'm up here talking, and I hope if there's times in which I haven't acted in a civil way, that people call me out on it, because we all need to be doing it, but we all need each other in order to do it right. And that's where I talk about, look, how do you build relationships, and make sure you approach it with this intellectual humility of understanding that, yes, I have strong beliefs, but I need to approach it where my mind isn't closed, but I'm open to hear what other people are talking about. Next slide. With the code of conduct, this is something that's critical, because what the code of conduct does is it sets what is acceptable behavior. And this is obviously, this is in the elected term, but you can translate it to other organizations in this way, in order to make sure that we're providing a comfortable space, a space that encourages relationships in this. And the code of conduct does remove those power struggles, because if when it's like, well, you hurt me, well, I don't see how I hurt you. Instead, you're able to go into, look, this is how, we said we're going to treat everybody, and you can point to that. Next slide. The transitions from campaigns, this is just, and think in this context, not just about campaigns, but if you know somebody that's gone, maybe they had this dialogue with the person, and it was a very, incivil conversation. They definitely felt attacked. Understand that because of what happened, they're going to pull back in other relationships. And so how can you help your neighbors, help your community members to connect and re-engage, after difficult conversations like that? Next slide. This minority-majority perspective, and I said I was going to come back around on it, because one of the things that, if you remember, I talked about, it's politically acceptable for the minority to speak out. And this is where I very much disagree when someone says just be civil. You need to make sure the minority's voice is heard. But when we've asked the question, are you in the minority or not, when it comes to politics, the community didn't say, well, I look to my city government or to my state legislature, to Congress. So if someone's elected to office, they can look around the dais and count and say, am I in the majority or not? But for the community member, the majority of our community members, they look to which party is in office as the president. So right now, we have a Democrat president, so anybody that's a Republican actually feels on the politics side that they're in the minority. Now, if you take this context, this might help explain some of the things that are going on in the state of Idaho, where you have individuals that are actually in the majority, since Idaho is a red state, but they're acting out like they're in the minority. And so you get this majority-minority piece and dynamic that's happening on the political side. There's some interesting facets to it that I'd like to study a little bit more on this. On how do you determine who is, how do people determine if they're a minority, and then what's acceptable in that way. Next one, competing perspectives. I've already talked about the strategic incivility related to it. You will have some situations where contempt is involved. They just hate you. They have contempt for you, and you understand it's going to be a one-sided civility conversation, and that's where you just kind of have to, okay, be the bigger person and still act appropriately. This next one was an interesting thing. I was in a conversation this last summer with a person. I was talking about the research that I'm doing and how Nicholas and I are working to get our legislators to work more collaboratively together. And then the person goes, I don't like that. He goes, I don't want that at all. He goes, because for me, I think any law that a government entity makes is wrong and is bad. And so this person started talking and goes, so in my perspective, I think dysfunction is good, because the more political dysfunction is going on, the less likely they can actually pass a law. And so there are, and I hope as I'm talking through this, you're actually better understanding some conversations you've had with some people that didn't make sense before. But their perspective is, I'm encouraging dysfunction because then there's going to be new laws. So they don't want them to work together. And that's one thing that is going to have to be overcome. And then getting into the ideological differences and the line in the sand, that is one that's the difficult one, because there's going to be things where individuals draw the line in the sand, but the most important thing for you is to look at the individual, their uniqueness, their dignity. What's the reason why they believe what they believe, and focus on that and try to get those conversations going. Next slide. I would definitely encourage you. We live in silos. We have certain groups that we tend to relate with. I mean, but find a new group next week that you haven't related with, and find somebody that you can sit down and just have a conversation and, let me understand your culture or your group or what it is that you believe. Break through some of those silos, because I think that's the piece that's going to make the difference, is to, experience those groups, to get to know them. Why do you believe what you believe on the individual? But then also it heads off rumors. Because this group talks about that group, even though they don't know them, with this rumor piece. And it also builds these liaisons, so if something does happen, and I look at it from a city perspective, it's not whether or not one of our police officers is going to make a mistake. It's when they're going to make a mistake. I mean, we're all fallible. Everybody's going to make a mistake at some time. Now, the issue is, was this on purpose, or not? I mean, that's where, if you've built these relationships, then they understand, okay, this was not the person's intent to offend me, and they just happened to say something and didn't understand the context of how they said it, and then you can have that conversation to help them understand and do better next time. Next slide. And then with technology, just understand when we use technology, it does remove relationships. Be present in meetings. It's really easy to be focused on other things in meetings, but it's that being present is going to make a big difference in those relationships and the people that you're relating to. And I know I'm guilty of that in a big way. Next slide. And then make sure if you're involved in any processes that you're doing, that you really work to make sure that you do the process in a way that people are going to trust. Because anytime a decision is made, there's going to be winners and losers. But if the process is one where it's an open process, everybody had their voice heard, it was decided fairly, and it was communicated well, people are more likely to then support it, even if it isn't what the outcome they wanted. But it's that process is something that's very important. Next slide. And I know this responding constituents is more from a elected side, but this is where I'd say think about the areas that you're in leadership in that way, that you are setting a standard as it relates to civility. And if you're in leadership, the people below you see that standard and they think, okay, I only have to do down here. They don't have to do better than you in that way. So the better each one of us can set a high standard, it's gonna then challenge people to step up that way. And I very firmly believe that leadership shouldn't expect that constituents have the same standard as themselves. I think the leadership should be held to a higher standard. That's just the nature of it. Even though I'd like everybody to be at the same standard, I also know that the leadership really is setting that example. Next slide. So with this last piece, this is where I talked about, first of all, the importance of us modeling civility, the taking time to engage in those difficult conversations. It's not easy, but it is critical, important for us. And then as leadership, if they're setting a good example, make sure you support them in that, to keep them going that way. Next slide. So within this, I talked about how we got here, the research that we did, and then also this last piece is, what are things that we can practically do with our path forward. And with that, I believe we have time for questions. And let me get another mic out there. Here we go. Thank you, Jan. The light's on.
Okay.
There we
go.
Thanks, Mark.
So, Francis, your book, is that, who published that? Or is that independently published?
So the book, WSU Press.
Oh, it's a WSU Press book?
It's a WSU Press book.
Okay.
And Nicholas and I have some copies that we're more than willing to give. And the book really is the research that we did from our study from the 1819, and then there's a number of different chapters where we looked at the impact of different things as it relates to legislative processes and civility. And so, there's things where we look at term limits, or we look at the gerrymandering, there's different things where we're polling numbers and trying to identify what are the things that are affecting the civility piece.
And my other question is, you're on City Council. So do you find this research has helped you, identify what's going on in the room? Are you constantly analyzing your colleagues up there, or?
It's funny, when I say I work for the psychology department, most people quiet down. They don't say anything. And I'm like, I'm an engineer. I'm not a psychologist. I have to reference that. But I'm always looking, trying to figure out why. Because everybody has a story, and everybody has a passion and a reason why they have that passion. And helping to understand that story can help understand the nuances of why they act one way or another. Because it's not always best to confront the face of it, but if you can figure out what's going on deeper, you can actually have a more meaningful engagement then that actually has a longer time, a longer change.
Thank you. Herb Hill.
Yeah.
Francis, yeah, that was great. And it reminded me of a conversation I had with a federal judge a few years ago in Kansas, and he's a Republican. And we were talking about what causes the polarization of our two parties and things that are in the country. And he said that he believed, and I never thought of this before, but that he believed that it was the staff, that the staff have an interest in seeing that our two beliefs are very polarized, because the more we hate each other and the more we're excited about things and the more I've got to win, the more I reach in my pocketbook and pay their salary. So ever since I heard that, I just don't know how you get around that.
So within that context, you have, when you're talking staff, you have partisan staff and you have nonpartisan staff. So the partisan staff, they're definitely motivated because if their party's in office, then they're going to make more money. And so for that. The nonpartisan, they work really hard not to go that direction. So I'd say, and if we look at when that partisanization happened, that would have been the 80s. And you'll actually see there were changes that happened in Congress at that time too, with certain political factions that came in at that time, and they changed some of the way things are done. So you have that. The other piece is, and I did touch on this one, but if you look at the media model, so when we're looking at news media, the media model, their funding model is conflict. There is conflict and controversy. And so their whole focus is conflict and controversy. And if you look at the stories that the media will write, and there's a couple of different papers on this, they actually write a higher percent of stories on where they talk to legislators and your Congress that are on the fringe than the moderates. Hi. Sorry. Is my mic not working? Oh.
Yeah, it's dead.
Okay.
If you could use the other one, and I'll get this one back to you.
And so what's happened is that the elected officials, in order to get interviewed, in order to get airtime, because they need airtime in order to get elected, have actually moved out to the fringes. And there's actually research that shows this has happened, that the media has actually driven our legislators out that direction also. I'm working with Paul Bowles, who is in the School of Communication, on a research project where we're looking at a media model that is not a conflict model, but is one that actually looks at, it's a collaboration model. And in some ways, the spokesman is actually moving that direction if you see some of the work that they've done. But so it's very much driving it.
So a couple of things struck me. So it sounded from the beginning like a large number of people would really like to get back to civility. But the other thing that it seems to me that there has been a shift in my lifetime in politics toward power for the sake of power. and that incivility, that strategic instability that you talked about, has been deployed more and more. And so I guess my question for you is, to what degree do you have to have some buy-in from both parties or all parties in order to move the civility needle back toward more civility? Or because it seems to me that if you're really in it for power for the sake of power, and the incivility is the way that you get that power, that there's no motivation to move that needle towards civility on the most incivil side, and that those who strive for civility are at a significant disadvantage. Can you talk about that?
And that's very true. Within that context, that's the reason why I talk about the community and local government is where to start, because most local governments are nonpartisan. For a city council, anybody should be able to come and talk to me. Now, I know as a community member, you're going to gravitate toward one council member or another, and it's not necessarily because they're in your district, but just because I relate to them, I align with them. But there should be this attitude of you can talk to anyone, and that a council member isn't focused on just one group or another group. Now, that isn't always the case with everybody, but it's how do we get people elected that way and move in that direction? Part of the challenge is people that are willing to step up and do it. So before I said I was going to run for council this last time, I looked at our council and I said, we're really doing a disservice in our community because we really do not have a diverse council as you're looking at cultural. And so I went and talked to a number of blacks and said, would you run for council? I would support you on it. So I sought a number of them out. And each one looked to me and said, why would I put myself out for that? I mean, that's what they said. And I understand, I understand where they're coming from. But I'm like, I'll do whatever I can to support you. And they're like, no. And so finally it was like, okay, I guess I better do it. Even though I definitely wanted to see a more diverse council, on our council, because I feel those voices, it's not that I feel anyone on our council is not listening to the different voices of the different cultures, but what it communicates to our community if we don't have a diversity of cultures up there can speak volumes. And so, so for me, I'm really actively working for how do we change Pullman so that our best people that are diverse within our community feel that, yes, I'd like to step up and I'd like to be in a leadership position. And I know I'm not going to get attacked because of my culture or because of, some aspect of my life. Did I answer everything? Okay. So it really, and that's where I say it's something that as a community, we need to rise up in this. As a community, if someone in leadership is doing something that's offensive, they need to be called out on it. And that can be a very difficult thing, and that's the reason why, Megan and I and other council members are working right now on a code of conduct, because we don't have a code of conduct for the Pullman Council. And so it's very difficult because then it's interpretations as opposed to here, this is the line that you crossed, and understand that was offensive.
Francis, what would you say to a state legislator or congressional candidate who saw your presentation and said, I would like to work towards a more civil arrangement, but in order to get elected and in order to get news coverage, I have to run negative ads because that is the only thing that moves the needle?
that's a personal decision that I feel it's wrong. I don't feel that a negative ad is going to be the solution. I know they're trying to elicit passion and get people to come out and vote. Over the years, I've had a number of people come to me with, "Oh, here's a tidbit for you to use in your next election," or "Here's," and it's like, no, if I go that route, I need to quit. That's because then Heidi and I have an agreement, and because Heidi was deep in politics in her family, and she saw a lot of backroom deals that went on. Just the nature of things that she had privy to. And when I first said I'm interested in running for council, she looked at me and said, "It'll corrupt you. There is no politician that's not corrupt." And so mine is, if I ever step into corruption, I have to walk away because I've just lost. Not my bet with my wife, but the thing that I said, I'm going to do it in a way that doesn't go this way. Sorry, I'm not. I shouldn't be talking about me, but I'm just using it as an illustrative that people have told them that they need to go that route, and they're listening to it. But I believe that there are better ways, and I honestly believe that our communities want people that will step up above the corruption piece, and will step up above the name calling, and will actually work hard in order to find common grounds and solutions. Because there's no one individual or one group that has all the solutions. It's when we get everybody in the room that together we can come up with the best solution. I really believe that.
Thank you so much, Francis, for coming tonight. Do you feel that the work you've done, or maybe do you have an example of maybe a positive impact it had on maybe a person or maybe a group of people?
So the things that if I look at the work that Nicholas and I have done, where we're working on how do we improve processes, we were one of the first ones to advocate for remote testimony, and where we had identified that in Eastern Washington, you have to spend a day to get to Olympia, testifying, then a day to come home, as opposed to in Western Washington, you can just drive in and back. And so there's a social cost from the eastern side that separates us. And we started that advocacy with the Secretary of State's office early on, and hit a lot of pushback and roadblocks, and finally with COVID it got implemented, but that's an example. Another one, as it related to relationships, what we identified is that legislators that, if you think about living in Eastern Washington, you'll often say, well, people in Western Washington don't understand what it's like here. And the same is, Western Washington don't understand us here. And so one of the things we worked out was connecting legislators that were from different parties, but from different areas of the state, and then one would travel and visit that legislator in their home district, and then the other one would come and travel into this district. So, and then they could talk about the constituent needs. So rather than yelling at each other type of thing, instead it was an opportunity to take them around and show, this is why this is important and passionate to my constituents. This is why it's important and compassionate. So they'd actually see it happening. So that's another example of things we've done. The one that I haven't gotten done yet is within our research, we did identify that sleep patterns are having tremendous impact on legislative processes, and that during the legislative session, the legislators, they sleep less, their quality of life is less, their relationships decline, and also their decision-making declines. So the longer they're in session, their decision-making actually declines, but it's related to sleep. And I had a sleep study put together that we actually had legislators and staff signed up for this thing, and then COVID hit. But where we were it was a 2-year study where we were gonna monitor sleep patterns of legislators outside of session and in session. Because what happens is when you're outside of session at home, you're in a normal sleep pattern, but when you come to the legislature, it's like going to a swing or a graveyard shift. It's that, and it affects their body, and they really don't get caught, they really don't transition to it. And so what we were working on was the first year was the monitor, and then the second year we were going to go in, and this was in collaboration with WSU Sleep Clinic up in Spokane, is to actually work with each individual legislator and staff on how to change your lifestyle even during the legislative session in order to improve your sleep. And part of what has to happen in this process is actually to change some of the legislative processes. That a lot of the legislative processes were put in place back in the 1950s, 1960s, and they're still running in the same way, irregardless of what we've learned around sleep and the dynamics of it and how it affects. So that's the one that's I'm still hoping to be able to get back to. But that one we had to get the governor's office to sign off on it, the Secretary of State's office to sign off on it. We had to get all 4 caucuses to sign off on it. We had to get the nonpartisan staff, their leadership in both the House and the Senate. So there's a lot of relationship pieces that are involved. So it's going to take me probably 1.5 years of relationships of building those back again to where we can do it. But that's something that I feel could be a game changer if we can get that one going. But that's, and I didn't even talk about sleep in here, but yeah.
Thanks, Francis, for doing this. I've heard Francis talk about this a couple of times and always learn something new. But this is more of a story speaking to your example of the person that texted and said, why are you talking to the enemy? So I was recently at a meeting up in Spokane, and I had the opportunity to meet the woman who is the legislative representative for Lewiston, who was appointed after the gentleman who left office resigned. And I think she was appointed. But anyway, she was telling me the story, she wanted to do this because she felt it was the right thing to do, and she wanted to give back, etc. And she said, I actively work with the other side in Idaho. And she said within like a month, there was a representative up in northern Idaho who started calling her a Marxist and all of these, very, very inflammatory things. And I guess I'm coming from, how do you even approach that kind of person to find common ground? If they're gonna go that way, where do you reach out to them to try and, because she can't even have a conversation with the woman. So, that's an extreme example, but unfortunately I think it's happening more and more.
And that's going to take one-on-one conversations, and you have, and I know of situations where individuals have, okay, I'm going to reach across the aisle and work across the aisle, and the leadership didn't like it, and the leadership basically blackballed them and drove them out. So I know that happens. So and that's where, I talked about legislative relationships, but also understanding the leadership. And it's that, so the first piece is figuring out is is it a legislative to legislative relationship, or is it a leadership that this person is just following the leadership, as their attack dog, basically? Because then that would then kind of help guide who she needs to talk to in the process. But we're in this partisan polarization to where it's really easy to group, name call someone, attach a name to them, and that's what they're seen as in that way. So, I mean, that's where I'd start, but.
So, for instance, as I understand, you and Nick will be putting together training sessions for legislators. Is that correct?
So we have, so we've been taking this out and working in different states related to this. Our first piece has been getting out in front of each state, and normally it's from the academic side is where we get invited in. But we right now, I'm trying to think, we've probably hit 10 states now, and have invites for, I think we got 4 that are in process right now related to that, of getting to the states. But when we're back in Delaware, we met with the Biden Institute to see other collaborations that we can do with the Institute. And if you look at the book, there's a number of prefaces from different groups that are in this space nationally that we're working with in order to get them our information and to work collaboratively with them to find solutions in that way. We have, with the National League of Cities, actually not National League of Cities, with one group, with the legislative, we've done our research not only in Washington, but we've also moved into 2 other states where we're working specifically with their legislature. The difficulty on the legislative side is, and what it has to do with is titles. So if you're a legislator, you're not interested if somebody's a local official or someone's a researcher, but you'll listen to someone who's from Congress. And it's an interesting dynamic in that way. So we do have, some congressmen that we have worked with in order to start this process, and they're kind of going around and talking about the importance of this to the legislators, and they're working on this legislative piece, because the legislators, they'll listen to a congressman. They're not going to listen to a researcher, and so we have to find a way to get our message to the right people to then get it to the right people.
Which leads me to my second question on that same topic. I think you also need to find a way to get the legislators to that conversation between constituents and legislators, in my limited experience, granted, could use a ton of work from the legislative side. I mean, I'm just asking innocent questions, trying to share my interest in a particular topic and ideas, and the response was astounding, really. It makes you walk away and go, my gosh, how did they get elected? I'm a constituent here. How does this happen?
And that's the qualities that take someone to get elected is different than the qualities they need to do the job. And that's the bottom line. And so if someone's out there and they look great on the campaign, you need to kind of take that step back and say, can you actually do the job? I had somebody was commenting yesterday, and they're saying, an elected position is, the example that the person uses, someone who has no finance experience can get elected and be over all the finances for the county. And, because there's no requirement that they have a CPA or it's what, and this so you have situations where people get elected to a position and it's bigger than what they can honestly do. And that's a difficult sort of thing. So,
anybody else? I just want to thank you, Francis. This was so interesting. And I did hear Nick present this this spring. And the thing that was a takeaway for me when Nick presented was he said, this kind of really negative interactions, it matters what you say, because what you say can hurt. It can really hurt people. Yeah. And I just, it was like, wow, yes, it can. It can do a lot of damage. So thank you for your research on this.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone for coming out.